Zohran Mamdani had just called JD Vance a poverty cosplayer on live television, delivering the phrase with the confidence of a politician who thought the insult had already done the work for him, as though one sharp line could erase an entire childhood and replace it with a convenient political caricature. New York City's 34-year-old socialist mayor, a man whose public image depended heavily on presenting himself as an ally of working families struggling with rent, groceries, transportation, and stagnant wages, appeared convinced that he had found the perfect weakness in the vice president's biography. Vance did not interrupt him, did not roll his eyes, did not scramble for a comeback, and did not reward Mamdani with the kind of theatrical reaction that would have turned the opening exchange into another disposable television shouting match. For 8 full minutes, Vance simply sat there, writing slowly on his legal pad while Mamdani attacked the credibility of hillbilly elegy, mocked the mythology of bootstraps, pointed toward Yale, Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel, and Vance's political evolution, and treated the entire biography as a marketing exercise. Then Vance put down his pen, opened the single folder sitting beside him, and the atmosphere changed from political theater into something far more uncomfortable for the man who had arrived expecting to control the cameras. By 9:45 that morning, 15 minutes before the chairman's gavel, the hearing room inside the Dirksen Senate office building was already packed, with every seat occupied and reporters filling the press gallery, because Washington understood that the official subject of the proceeding was only the paperwork wrapped around the real confrontation. C-SPAN was running dual feeds. CNN, Fox, and MSNBC had live coverage, an unusual level of attention for something formally titled Federal Municipal Accountability, Urban Policy, and Public Funds, a name so bureaucratic it could have put an accountant to sleep before breakfast. But nobody had shown up because of the title, and nobody believed this was going to be a dry discussion about municipal accounting rules, federal grants, or administrative procedure. The witness list told the real story because Mayor Zohran Mamdani had been summoned to answer questions about federal funding connected to the policies that had defined his administration, including city-owned grocery stores, universal rent freezes, and free bus transit. Supporters described those ideas as survival for working families. Critics called them socialism with a municipal budget attached, and everyone in the room knew that JD Vance would be the person sitting across from Mamdani when those policies were finally forced through the arithmetic instead of the applause line. Mamdani entered the room exactly as he had entered so many political spaces before it, relaxed enough to suggest that the cameras belonged there because he belonged there, wearing a slim navy suit without a tie and white sneakers that reinforced the carefully casual image that had become part of his political branding. His staff followed close behind him, carrying tablets and briefing material, their expressions carrying the unmistakable confidence of a team that expected its candidate to leave with a collection of viral clips rather than a stack of unanswered questions. Mamdani settled into the witness chair like he was taking a seat at a neighborhood cafe instead of appearing before a federal hearing, crossing one ankle over the opposite knee, letting one arm rest comfortably, and adjusting the microphone with a kind of casual precision that looked effortless precisely because it had been practiced. Cameras immediately began clicking, reporters leaned forward, and social media accounts prepared themselves for the inevitable confrontation because Mamdani had built a reputation on turning confrontation into content faster than most politicians could turn a page. Vance, meanwhile, was already seated behind the elevated dais in a dark suit with an American flag pin, writing in small, measured strokes beside one folder. No mountain of binders, no theatrical stack of evidence, no visible attempt to compete for attention before the hearing had even begun. When Mamdani was recognized for his opening statement, he leaned toward the microphone, wearing the broad, controlled smile that had accompanied his rise from a Queen's Assembly seat to Gracie Mansion, and he immediately made clear that he had no intention of treating the proceeding as an ordinary policy hearing. He thanked the chairman, thanked the vice president, joked that invitation might be too generous because summons was probably the more accurate word, and drew the expected laughter from the Democratic side before turning directly toward Vance. Mamdani said he knew why he was really there, and instead of beginning with grocery prices, bus fares, housing construction, or the financial mechanics of his own agenda, he chose to spend the opening minutes dissecting Vance's biography. He brought up Hillbilly Elegy, called it a bestseller and a Netflix movie, described the story of a poor Ohio kid pulling himself upward as a beautiful narrative with excellent branding, and then attacked the central premise by pointing to Yale Law School, Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley, and the accomplished family Vance eventually married into. The argument was simple and deliberately cutting. Mamdani wanted the audience to believe that whatever hardship existed at the beginning of Vance's life had been overwritten by the doors that opened later, turning survival into branding and opportunity into retroactive proof that the struggle had somehow never been real. He told Vance that his bootstraps had effectively been custom made, that a golden rope had been thrown down rather than a wall climbed barehanded, and then moved from biography into political loyalty by resurrecting Vance's old criticism of Donald Trump. Mamdani reminded the room that Vance had once described Trump in brutal terms, had once considered voting for Hillary Clinton, and now served as vice president in Trump's administration, presenting the shift not as political evolution but as proof of opportunism. He called it a weather vane story rather than a bootstrap story, suggesting that Vance simply pointed wherever political winds were strongest, and the line landed exactly the way Mamdani intended, producing murmurs in the room and instant activity in the press gallery. From there, Mamdani widened the attack, contrasting his own job running a city of roughly 8.3 million people with Vance's memoir, dismissing the hearing itself as an attempt by Washington to force an elected mayor to explain policies voters had knowingly chosen. By the time he leaned back from the microphone, his expression suggested that he believed the opening round was finished and that the only remaining question was how quickly the clips would spread. For 8 minutes, Vance had not given him anything, and that absence of reaction now became the most important part of the exchange because Mamdani had spent his entire opening statement throwing punches at a man who had refused to enter the performance. Vance's pen had moved at the same steady pace from beginning to end, without interruption, without visible irritation, and without the facial expressions television producers depend on when they want to package conflict into 15-second fragments. When Mamdani finally stopped, Vance set the pen down, squared the legal pad in front of him, looked directly across the room, and asked with complete flatness whether the mayor was finished. Mamdani indicated that he had more to say, but Vance answered that he was sure he did, then pointed out that the mayor had spent 8 minutes talking about him and had therefore earned a few minutes of examination in return. Only then did Vance open the folder, and what followed began not with a speech about ideology, not with a sermon about socialism, and not with another insult, but with the phrase Mamdani himself had chosen. Vance repeated "poverty cosplayer" and asked Mamdani to clarify exactly what he meant, reducing the accusation to its raw claim. Was Mamdani saying the poverty was fake, the childhood manufactured, and the biography constructed for political consumption? Mamdani tried to describe the story as more complicated, but Vance cut through the escape route with the simplest possible answer, telling him they could uncomplicate it by comparing their childhoods side by side and allowing the public to decide who had actually been pretending. He removed a single sheet of paper and began with the part of his life that did not fit neatly into Mamdani's joke, describing being 11 years old when his mother overdosed for the 3rd time, coming home from school, finding her on the kitchen floor, calling 911, and holding her head while waiting for paramedics. There was no dramatic embellishment in the delivery, No attempt to ask the room for sympathy, and no raised voice because the brutality of the facts did not require decoration. The room that had laughed only minutes earlier became quiet as Vance continued describing cereal for dinner, not as some nostalgic symbol of modest working class life, but because there often was not money for anything better. He talked about his grandmother, Mama, the woman who raised him, carried a loaded revolver in her purse, swore with spectacular force, and in Vance's description, quite literally kept him alive when the adults and circumstances around him could not be relied upon to do it. He reminded Mamdani that he joined the Marines at 18, attended Ohio State using the GI Bill, and reached Yale through grades and test scores without arriving there through a network of family connections that already understood elite institutions from the inside. Vance recalled not knowing which fork to use at his first Yale cocktail party, an awkward detail he had written about precisely because it represented the cultural distance between where he came from and the world he had suddenly entered. None of that required Mamdani to agree with Vance's politics, and none of it required anyone to admire what Vance later became, because the issue Mamdani had chosen was not policy, but authenticity. And authenticity can become a dangerous battlefield when the documents begin arriving. Vance set down the page containing his own story and reached into the folder for the material concerning the man who had just accused him of wearing poverty like a costume. The first document was a school profile for Bank Street School for Children on Manhattan's Upper West Side, and Vance held it up while identifying current tuition at roughly $66,400 per year. He did not need to invent an insult because the comparison itself carried more force than another round of name-calling. 1 year of elementary school tuition at that institution exceeded what Vance said his family had earned across several years of his childhood. Mamdani's relaxed posture changed almost immediately, his crossed ankle dropping as he sat straighter, because the conversation had moved away from abstract language about privilege and into concrete institutions, tuition figures, family background, and records that could be placed directly in front of the cameras. Vance continued through Mamdani's education, noting the Bronx High School of Science and Bowdoin College, before turning toward the family environment surrounding that education, including his mother, filmmaker Mira Nair, and his father, Columbia University professor Mahmoud Mamdani. The frame Mamdani had built during his opening statement was now being turned around on him with brutal efficiency. If childhood privilege disqualified someone from claiming solidarity with hardship, the mayor who had launched that standard was suddenly the person being measured by it. Vance described Mamdani growing up in Columbia University faculty housing in Manhattan and contrasted that background with the instability he had just described from his own childhood, not because wealth itself was criminal, but because Mamdani had chosen to begin the hearing by questioning whether someone else's poverty had been authentic. He then produced material showing the Mamdani family property in Uganda, a large villa on Buziga Hill overlooking Lake Victoria, complete with multiple bedrooms, landscaped grounds, a swimming pool, and the comforts of a gated compound, another detail that sat awkwardly beside the mayor's political rhetoric about inequality and private property. Vance explicitly acknowledged the obvious point that Mamdani had not chosen his parents and had committed no offense merely by growing up with advantages, because being born into a successful family was not the charge and never had been. The problem, as Vance framed it, was the political construction that came afterward. The presentation of Mamdani as a voice of ordinary economic struggle, while the family background behind that presentation looked dramatically different from the image projected in speeches and campaigns. The poverty cosplayer insult had therefore survived less than 10 minutes before Vance turned it back toward the man who had coined it, and the hearing was only beginning. Vance kept moving because once the comparison between biography and branding had been established, the larger problem was no longer whether Mamdani had grown up comfortable, but whether he had repeatedly converted political identity into a substitute for factual precision whenever the cameras were rolling. He pulled out Mamdani's financial disclosure and pointed to the figure showing roughly $2,000 in a personal bank account, a number that fit perfectly inside the image of an ordinary young politician living modestly in a rent-stabilized apartment, until that number was placed beside a family background involving elite education, internationally successful parents, and property spread across multiple countries. Vance did not argue that children automatically own their parents' assets, and he did not need to because the contradiction he was pressing was narrower and much more damaging. Mamdani had built political credibility by speaking the language of material struggle while allowing voters to see only the fragments of his financial reality that reinforced that image. He returned to the Uganda property, noting that roughly 40% of Ugandans lived on less than $2 per day, while the Mamdani family property featured a swimming pool and landscaped grounds in one of the wealthier areas outside Kampala. And the irony landed without needing to be dressed up. Mamdani responded that he did not control his parents' assets and lived in a rent-stabilized apartment in Astoria, but Vance immediately seized on the second half of the answer because a politician surrounded by family wealth defending his own place inside a rent-stabilized system was not exactly the devastating rebuttal his staff appeared to hope it would be. Vance then summarized the point with brutal simplicity. He had been accused of faking poverty by a man whose own working-class image had been assembled over a background of private schooling, elite universities, Columbia faculty housing, international family property, and parents whose professional status placed them nowhere near the economic insecurity Mamdani claimed to represent politically. That did not make Mamdani guilty of anything, and Vance said so, but it did make the opening insult look reckless, because once the mayor had chosen childhood hardship as the battlefield, he had invited direct comparison and walked into it carrying the weaker record. The issue was no longer whether Mamdani supported progressive policies or whether Vance opposed them, but whether the person accusing someone else of wearing poverty as a costume had spent years carefully tailoring his own political presentation. Vance described his own poverty as documented in a book that had been scrutinized for years by journalists eager to challenge it, while Mamdani's image of working-class solidarity, in Vance's framing, rested on selective presentation and political branding. Then he turned the page, leaving the question of childhood behind and moving into something even more dangerous for Mamdani, because the next subject involved not an ideology or a policy forecast, but a personal story the mayor had told publicly with tears in his eyes. Vance reminded Mamdani of the speech he delivered on October 24, 2025, outside the Islamic Cultural Center in the Bronx, when he spoke about the fear Muslims experienced after September 11th and described the memory of an aunt who supposedly stopped taking the subway because she no longer felt safe wearing a hijab. It had been a powerful story precisely because it sounded intimate, specific, and personal, a family memory placed inside a national trauma, and Vance now treated that specificity as the reason the story had to withstand verification. He produced a professional profile for Mamdani's biological aunt, Dr. Masuma Mamdani, and stated that according to publicly available information, she had been living and working in Tanzania on September 11, 2001, not commuting through New York City. He then referenced public photographs showing that she did not wear a hijab, placing the two factual details beside the emotional speech and allowing the contradiction to sit in the room without theatrical assistance. Mamdani's posture changed again because this was not a disagreement over how to interpret a budget or whether a political slogan had been fair, but a challenge to the literal accuracy of a family story he had used in one of the most emotionally charged settings available to an American politician. Mamdani responded that in his culture, the word aunt could refer more broadly to an older female relative, and said he had been referring to Zara Furi, his father's cousin, who had since died. Vance repeated the distinction carefully, pointing out that the woman described publicly as my aunt was therefore not Mamdani's biological aunt, but a more distant relative who could no longer personally confirm the story, and he emphasized that ordinary listeners hearing the phrase "my aunt" would naturally understand it in the usual familial sense. The point was not a semantic game about kinship vocabulary, because Vance was attacking the way a political anecdote had been shaped for maximum emotional clarity, while the underlying relationship became much less clear once reporters started asking questions. He also stressed that Mamdani's campaign had not immediately provided a fully verifiable explanation when the discrepancy first became an issue, which made the correction look less like context and more like repair after the original story had already done its political work. The air in the room had changed completely from the casual confidence of the opening statement, because every new document forced Mamdani away from broad moral language and into the narrower territory where dates, names, relationships, and public records either aligned or they did not. Vance then introduced the most explosive element of the section, a campaign strategy memo dated October 15th, 9 days before Mamdani's speech, with the subject line, Islamophobia, Messaging Personal Story Angle. He described the document as internal campaign communication obtained through a FOIA adjacent request, while noting that its authenticity had been disputed but not, in his telling, directly denied by Mamdani's team, and he read from language recommending a family narrative tied to post-9/11 discrimination and an emotional public address timed around early voting. The significance was obvious. If the memo was authentic, then the speech Mamdani had presented as a deeply personal moment had also been discussed internally as an electoral messaging opportunity, which turned emotional vulnerability into something far more calculated. Vance did not need to argue that anti-Muslim discrimination after September 11th had been imaginary, because Mamdani himself tried to retreat toward that broader and safer truth, insisting that he was sharing the real experience of Muslims in New York after the attacks. Vance's response was devastating because it separated the general truth from the specific story, saying in effect that an experience can be real while a politician's personal anecdote about that experience can still be false. He then sharpened the moral charge, invoking the 2,977 people murdered on September 11th and accusing Mamdani of using national tragedy as campaign material, not simply because he spoke about discrimination afterward, but because the personal story carrying the emotional burden appeared, under Vance's examination, to have been selected and scheduled for political effect. Mamdani tried to frame the discussion around the genuine fear Muslim New Yorkers experienced in the aftermath of the attacks, but Vance refused to let him dissolve a specific, factual challenge into a broader sociological truth. The room remained quiet because the argument was now structured in a way Mamdani could not easily escape. Either the relative, timeline, hijab detail, and campaign memo aligned with the public story or they did not, and repeatedly returning to the reality of Islamophobia could not automatically resolve those inconsistencies. Behind Mamdani, his communications director closed her laptop, a tiny movement that nevertheless captured the change in atmosphere better than another speech could have, because the team that had entered expecting viral triumph was now watching the hearing become a record-by-record examination of its own campaign material. Vance did not slow down, did not allow the room to reset, and did not offer Mamdani a clean transition back to safer territory before reaching for the next set of documents. The next section concerned campaign money, and Vance produced a summary indicating that Mamdani's mayoral operation had accepted somewhere between 161 and 170 contributions connected to donors listing foreign addresses, including locations in the United Arab Emirates, Australia, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, totaling roughly $12,000 to $13,000. Vance stated the legal rule in the bluntest terms available. Foreign nationals are prohibited from contributing to American elections, not advised against it, not discouraged from doing it, but prohibited, and he argued that a number approaching 170 could not be waved away as a single accidental filing. Mamdani answered that the campaign had returned donations that were flagged and had cooperated with authorities, but Vance attacked the sequence rather than the correction, insisting that compliance after a problem became public was damage control rather than proof that the system had worked properly in the first place. Whether each contribution ultimately represented an illegal foreign national donation would be a legal question, but inside the hearing, Vance was using the volume of flagged donations to reinforce the pattern he had already constructed, one in which Mamdani's public certainty repeatedly looked less impressive once paperwork entered the conversation. And before Mamdani could rebuild momentum, Vance lifted another document from the folder, this time not a financial record, but a photograph that would pull the hearing into an entirely different and even more combustible subject. The photograph Vance raised next showed Mamdani standing beside Imam Siraj Wahhaj, both men smiling for the camera, and Vance immediately identified the image as one Mamdani himself had posted publicly on October 7th, 2025. Vance then laid out the history attached to Wahhaj's name, describing him as an unindicted co-conspirator in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing case, a character witness for Omar Abdel Rahman, and a religious figure whose past statements had generated years of controversy over American democracy and Islamic governance. The point Vance was constructing was not complicated. Mamdani had spent years presenting himself as someone uniquely qualified to identify extremism, prejudice, injustice, and moral failure in everyone else. Yet he had voluntarily stood beside a man carrying that history and had published the photograph himself. The timing made the image even more politically toxic inside the hearing, because Vance emphasized that Mamdani posted it on the anniversary of the October 7th attack on Israel, when roughly 1,200 people had been killed, turning what Mamdani may have regarded as ordinary community outreach into something Vance portrayed as another example of astonishing political judgment. Mamdani pushed back by describing Wahhaj as a respected community leader who had met many public officials, but Vance refused to let the answer dissolve into the familiar defense that everyone meets controversial people, because Mamdani's entire political brand depended on demanding moral clarity from others, and therefore invited the same standard when his own photographs were placed under examination. Vance's attack then expanded from Mamdani's associations to the social media history of Mamdani's wife Rama Duwaji, and he began laying screenshots across the dais one after another, not as an independent accusation against Mamdani for every opinion another adult had expressed, but as another challenge to the political environment surrounding the mayor. He referenced a 2017 Tumblr post featuring Layla Khaled, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine who had participated in airplane hijackings, then moved to an older repost celebrating Shadia Abu Ghazala, before pointing to a 2024 Instagram interaction involving claims about reported sexual violence during the October 7th attack. Mamdani responded that his wife had made controversial posts when she was young and had apologized, attempting to place the material inside the category of immature social media activity that should not permanently define a person. Vance immediately challenged that defense by noting that she had been 20 years old in 2017, legally an adult, and he used the age not merely as a technical correction, but as a way to strip away the softer language Mamdani was using to reduce the political significance of the posts. He then rejected Mamdani's description of Duwaji as a private person without an official role in the administration, arguing that the First Lady of New York City, visible beside the mayor at major public events and part of the administration's public image, whether formally employed or not, could not simply be declared politically invisible whenever scrutiny became inconvenient. From there, Vance introduced a network diagram connecting figures in Mamdani's political orbit, including Linda Sarsour, organizational donors, advocacy groups, and other controversial names, and used the visual to widen the question beyond any single photograph or old social media post. He was careful in one crucial respect, explicitly saying that he was not calling Mamdani a terrorist, because making that accusation would have been both reckless and far beyond the evidence he had presented. Instead, he asked why the mayor repeatedly appeared beside people who had themselves attracted scrutiny over extremism, terrorism-related cases, or inflammatory political rhetoric, forcing Mamdani to defend a pattern rather than one isolated event. Mamdani attempted to shut down the entire line of questioning by calling it Islamophobic, an accusation designed to move the hearing away from the specific names, dates, photographs, and public statements Vance had displayed and toward a broader argument about prejudice against Muslim Americans. Vance rejected that escape immediately, saying that millions of Muslim Americans had never posed for photographs with figures connected to the World Trade Center bombing case, and insisting that the issue was Mamdani's individual judgment, not his religion, and not the religion of American Muslims generally. Then the hearing changed gears again, and the shift was almost surgical, because after attacking biography, campaign narratives, donations, associations, and judgment, Vance finally turned to the subject Mamdani had supposedly been summoned to discuss in the first place: governing New York City. The vice president leaned back, pulled out economic analyses, controller reports, and news coverage, and began with Mamdani's signature proposal for city-owned grocery stores that would sell food at prices roughly 30% below private retailers. Vance reduced the proposal to the question that campaign slogans had conveniently avoided: if grocery stores generally operate on margins of only 1 to 3%, where exactly does a 30% discount come from without continuous taxpayer subsidy? He cited analysis arguing that the numbers did not work, referenced economists who had called the proposal economically incoherent, and noted with deliberate irony that some of those critics came from Columbia University, the same institution where Mamdani's father held a professorship. Mamdani tried to answer by talking about eliminating middlemen and streamlining supply chains, but Vance kept driving through the financial structure, because cutting rhetoric apart is much easier once every claim is forced to answer the same ugly question political advertising hates: who pays the difference? Vance pointed to a taxpayer-funded grocery experiment in Kansas City that had failed and closed, and to a planned Chicago project that had been abandoned as impractical, presenting Mamdani's New York proposal not as a proven model waiting to be scaled, but as another ideological experiment whose arithmetic remained unresolved. He then brought the argument down from abstract economics to the street level, focusing on bodega owners, immigrant shopkeepers, and neighborhood grocers who already operated on microscopic margins and who could not compete indefinitely against a government store capable of covering losses with public money. That was the contradiction Vance wanted viewers to remember. The mayor, who constantly spoke about defending working-class immigrants, was proposing a system that, according to its critics, could put precisely those small entrepreneurs under direct pressure from a taxpayer-backed competitor. Vance accused Mamdani of treating retail grocery operations as though political conviction could replace inventory management, labor costs, spoilage, rent, logistics, and margins, all the mundane realities that do not disappear merely because a campaign poster says food should be cheaper. The attack was effective because it did not require anyone in the room to oppose affordable groceries. It required Mamdani to explain how promising prices 30% below market could survive contact with a business where a 3% margin is already considered respectable. Vance moved next to the rent freeze, another pillar of Mamdani's agenda, and reminded the hearing that Mamdani had appointed 6 of the 9 members of the Rent Guidelines Board before the board voted 7-1 to freeze rents on roughly 1 million apartments. He cited reports that landlords were cutting maintenance budgets and reducing building staff, then pointed to city building data showing new construction permit applications falling 38% during the first 6 months of Mamdani's administration. Vance wrote the number down large enough for the cameras to capture it because 38% did not need a metaphor, and he argued that freezing rents while discouraging new supply could leave existing tenants inside deteriorating buildings while making it even harder for future tenants to find apartments. His accusation was not that rent was affordable before Mamdani, or that New York had possessed some healthy housing market suddenly destroyed overnight because the city's housing crisis plainly predated the mayor, but that Mamdani's answer risked locking scarcity into place while selling the freeze itself as proof of success. In Vance's formulation, the mayor had frozen the price and then helped freeze the supply with it, a politically satisfying short-term announcement attached to consequences that would appear later in fewer permits, fewer repairs, fewer available units, and more people fighting over the same constrained inventory. The documents kept coming as Vance turned to universal childcare, saying independent estimates put the likely cost roughly 50% above what Mamdani's campaign had advertised, and then to free bus transit, where he cited a $31 million decline in fare revenue during the administration's first 6 months. He referenced the MTA chair's concern that campaign rhetoric may have contributed to the drop, using the figure to hammer the same point that had dominated the grocery and housing sections. Declaring something free does not eliminate its cost. It simply changes who is forced to absorb it. Vance then moved rapidly through personnel controversies, mentioning housing official CEA Weaver and her past description of homeownership as white supremacy, a city employee fired after raising misconduct concerns involving an appointee, and repeated vetting problems surrounding members of Mamdani's administration. By this stage, Mamdani was flipping quickly through briefing pages his staff had pushed toward him, scanning for statistics, rebuttals, or language that could restore the effortless confidence he had displayed during his opening statement, but the rhythm of the hearing no longer belonged to him. Vance finally brought the section together by accusing Mamdani of pretending to be a grocery operator, pretending rent freezes had no effect on supply, pretending transit could become free without someone carrying the cost, and pretending a city of more than 8 million people could be governed by slogans that sounded wonderful until somebody opened a spreadsheet. The cruelty of the argument was that Vance turned Mamdani's original insult back on him without needing to repeat it every 30 seconds, because cosplay had become the organizing accusation against the mayor's entire governing style rather than merely his biography. Vance argued that Mamdani could survive the consequences of his own policies more comfortably than many of the people those policies claimed to protect, pointing again to the mayor's rent-stabilized apartment and financially successful family while contrasting that cushion with the bodega owner facing a publicly subsidized competitor, the building superintendent facing reduced maintenance payrolls, and the family searching for an apartment in a market where construction had slowed. The criticism was merciless because it attacked the distinction between performing solidarity and carrying risk. Mamdani could champion experiments from City Hall, but small businesses, landlords, employees, commuters, and tenants would absorb the costs if the numbers failed. Vance closed the policy folder with the line that defined the entire section, saying that the difference between socialism and governing was that governing required math, and the statement landed because every preceding document had been arranged to make Mamdani look less like an administrator defending a functioning model and more like an activist discovering invoices after the slogans had already been printed. But Vance was not finished, because after the economics came the subject that would produce the longest silence of the hearing, and this time he did not need a stack of charts, a financial disclosure, or a network diagram to begin. Vance removed his reading glasses and set them carefully on the dais before moving into the final section, and the change in his posture mattered because the hearing was no longer about tuition, campaign finance, grocery margins or rent policy, but about the political responsibility of a mayor governing the largest Jewish population of any city outside Israel. He reminded Mamdani that roughly 1.1 million Jewish New Yorkers lived under his administration, and then pointed to what he described as one of Mamdani's earliest official decisions, the removal of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism from the city's framework. Vance pressed the timing hard, arguing that before the administration had even established itself on crime, housing, sanitation, transportation, or the cost of living, Mamdani had already chosen to alter the standard used to identify anti-Jewish hatred. He then cited Mamdani's public attack on Israel's prime minister, including language accusing him of genocide and saying he was unwelcome in New York, and placed those statements beside growing anxiety among Jewish residents who believed City Hall's rhetoric had crossed from foreign policy criticism into something much more corrosive. The pressure in the room became heavier because Vance was no longer asking whether Mamdani's intentions were pure, progressive, or intellectually defensible. He was asking what the effect of that rhetoric was on the people the mayor was obligated to protect. Vance cited an open letter from rabbis who argued that Mamdani's rhetoric might not be anti-Semitic in intent, but could still operate that way in effect, and he used their words precisely because they came from leaders within the communities Mamdani governed rather than from Republican strategists outside New York. He then moved to the phrase, globalize the intifada, noting that reporters, community leaders, and elected officials had repeatedly asked Mamdani to condemn it clearly, and that Mamdani had instead said he would discourage its use. Vance seized on that word because discourage sounded absurdly weak when applied to language that many Jewish Americans understand as a call to spread violent uprising beyond Israel, and he treated Mamdani's semantic caution as another example of a politician desperate to preserve support from competing factions without paying the cost of choosing one position openly. Mamdani remained still, hands flat against the witness table, while Vance argued that moral leadership becomes meaningless when every difficult answer is diluted until no constituency can accuse the politician of having actually said anything. Then Vance introduced what he described as a summary of an internal communications strategy session in which an advisor had allegedly recommended an explicit condemnation of Hamas, and the response, according to the document, was that doing so would risk losing the political base. Mamdani immediately called the document fabricated, but Vance did not spend time debating the provenance, because he shifted instantly from the disputed paper to a question Mamdani could answer without any document at all. He asked Mamdani to condemn Hamas by name, directly, on camera, without replacing the organization with phrases about violence generally, structural oppression, civilian suffering, or political complexity. Mamdani responded by condemning violence against civilians, language broad enough to sound morally acceptable while avoiding the exact name Vance had demanded, and that avoidance became the entire point of the exchange. Vance interrupted with the obvious distinction, saying that he had not asked for a generic denunciation of violence, but for a specific condemnation of Hamas, the organization responsible for the October 7th attack in which approximately 1,200 people were killed. The room went silent because the question was brutally narrow, the kind of question political professionals hate precisely because a carefully engineered answer cannot expand the frame without revealing that the speaker is trying to escape it. Vance drew on his Marine service and said he knew what terrorism looked like, using that personal history not as decoration, but as another contrast between direct language and the layers of qualification Mamdani kept placing between himself and the answer. He said that when someone asked him whether he condemned terrorists, the answer was yes, not discourage, not complex, not an essay about structural conditions, just yes. He told Mamdani that New York's Jewish population deserved to understand why their mayor could not say that simple word with the same confidence he had displayed while attacking Vance 8 minutes earlier. Mamdani stared toward the microphone, and behind him his staff had stopped typing, stopped passing notes, stopped behaving like a team waiting for the next winning clip, because by then the hearing had become a succession of defensive positions rather than a stage for Mamdani's performance. When Mamdani finally suggested that his testimony had already covered the relevant policy areas and indicated that he wanted to leave, Vance told him he was free to do so, but added one final observation. Every question had been based, according to Vance, on Mamdani's public statements, disclosures, campaign filings, photographs, or other material already associated with the mayor. Vance said that if anything presented during the hearing was wrong, Mamdani needed only to correct it, and then he allowed the silence to do what another paragraph of accusation could not. He pointed out that Mamdani had not corrected the central claims, and the mayor sat motionless for several seconds, looking across the dais, press gallery, staff section, and exit, as though calculating how to end a hearing that had started with him calculating how to dominate it. His chief of staff leaned toward him, whispered something, and Mamdani gathered his papers with mechanical calm, thanked the chairman, stood, and left without looking toward Vance. The staff that had entered behind him with tablets out and faces prepared for victory now closed around him as they moved into the corridor, but the visible confidence of their arrival had disappeared. Vance organized the folder, capped his pen, nodded to the chairman, and ended with no further questions, an almost anticlimactic gesture after a hearing that had steadily dismantled the premise of Mamdani's opening attack. The clip that spread fastest afterward was not necessarily the private school tuition, the Uganda villa, the ant controversy, the photograph with Wahaj, or even the challenge to condemn Hamas, but the few seconds after Vance told Mamdani that he had not corrected anything. The frozen expression, the scanning eyes, and the silence gave social media exactly what it always wants: a short visual that could be detached from a long hearing and turned into a symbol larger than the exchange that produced it. Memes spread, the socialist prince insult trended, images of the Uganda property circulated with political captions, and the city-owned grocery proposal became a target for jokes about politicians trying to run retail businesses they had never managed themselves. Conservative media replayed the hearing relentlessly, but criticism also appeared outside explicitly conservative outlets, especially around the financial disclosures, campaign contributions, and the need for Mamdani to answer factual questions rather than dismiss the proceeding as partisan theater. Mamdani's office eventually released a statement describing the hearing as politically motivated and Islamophobic, but according to the script, the statement did not directly address several of the specific issues Vance had raised, which only extended the argument that the mayor's strongest weapon was accusation, while his weakest position remained documentation. Political consequences followed quickly in the script, beginning with New York City Council members demanding independent review of the government grocery program before additional money could be committed. The foreign donation controversy moved toward greater legal scrutiny. Financial disclosures attracted congressional attention, and Jewish organizations intensified pressure over the IHRA definition, the October 7th rhetoric, and Mamdani's refusal during the hearing to condemn Hamas in the exact terms Vance demanded. Democratic allies began distancing themselves carefully rather than dramatically, using phrases about transparency, fiscal responsibility, and accountability that avoided naming Mamdani while making clear that his political problems were no longer confined to Republican attacks. His approval numbers fell sharply in the narrative, especially among older voters and Jewish New Yorkers, while a potential primary challenger, small business owner Farah Hassan, emerged with a message centered on the practical economics of running neighborhood grocery stores rather than designing public versions from City Hall. Her campaign imagery showed early mornings, shelves, registers, employees, taxes, and the unglamorous routine of retail work, creating the same contrast Vance had exploited throughout the hearing. Lived operational experience on one side, political theory on the other. For Vance, the confrontation reinforced the political identity that hillbilly elegy had always offered him, the idea that his authority came from hardship he could document rather than hardship he merely claimed to understand. When later asked about the exchange, he returned to the same basic defense, saying Mamdani had attacked first, had called him a poverty cosplayer, and had simply encountered an opponent carrying better material. The script closes not in Washington, but in a Queens bodega, where an immigrant owner named Muhammad al-Harazi watches the hearing while doing the work Mamdani's grocery policy claims to improve, calculating margins in his head, because for him, those numbers are not ideological abstractions, but the difference between staying open and shutting down. He looks at the shelves he stocked, the register he bought secondhand, the customers he knows by name, and rejects the idea that someone who has never stood behind that counter can casually promise prices 30% below market without understanding what disappears when the margin disappears. Then he turns off the television and goes back to work, leaving the script with its final judgment intact. Mamdani entered the hearing trying to expose Vance as a manufactured symbol of poverty, but the documents, numbers, and contradictions turned the accusation around, and the man who arrived with the sharper slogan left without the stronger record.